Well, good morning. It's good to actually have people say that back when I say it too. That's fantastic. Hey, my name's Matt. I'm the minister here at North. Man, I'm glad to see you all. Welcome back to church, huh?
Amen.
Yeah. And for the first time, will y'all turn around, look at that camera right there, and wave to everybody who's joining us online. We are trying to venture out into online live streaming. Sometimes it doesn't work as well as others. So you were here, the people who were watching during first service got to see us, but didn't get to hear us for at least half the service, so that was fun. But we are getting into it, so we're thankful for all of you as well who are joining us online. Man, I'm glad to be back. Are you glad to be back?
Amen.
Yeah. It's been a long, 3 months of watching things online, and you can only go down into your basement in your pajamas and watch church online for so many times before you start to feel weird about it, right? Oh, too much information? Yeah. First service thought that too. So man, it's good to be back. Happy Father's Day as well. Dads, we're glad for you. We're blessed by you, and so happy Father's Day to you as well. Today we are going to continue talking through our series that we've been in for the last almost couple months now. We've been working our way through 1 Peter and talking about what we are called to as believers to both live here as citizens of this earth as well as there as citizens in the kingdom of heaven. And so this whole series has been framed around this idea of here, there, living here as well as there, and looking to see how and what God calls us to be here as well as looking forward to being in heaven there. And so we're in 1 Peter chapter 2. If you want to flip there and stick a thumb in it, we'll get there in just a little bit. But today I want to start by talking about parenting. Always a fun subject to talk about. I don't know if you have noticed this or not, but like parents, we will do almost anything that we can, right, to keep our kids from suffering, right? Like as a general rule, we don't want our kids to suffer, right?
That's right.
Let me push against that a little bit by giving you an example of my parenting and what I choose to do with my kids. I don't know if you do this or not or have done this, but in teaching my kids to catch a ball, I do not adopt that philosophy of keeping them from suffering. And here's how it is. And understand, it is a soft ball. That needs to be stated. I was feeling judged earlier, okay? Here's the thing. We have this soft, kind of squishy ball, whatever. And for all of my kids, I've kind of adopted the philosophy that you toss it gently at their face, and eventually they're going to learn how to catch it or continue to get hit in the face. I'm feeling judged here. Come on now.
I agree with you.
Thank you, Gina. One person, you and I, can just, that's what we do. That's my philosophy for catching the ball. And here's the thing, they're going to learn to catch it, or they're going to keep getting hit in the head with the ball. I would never do that with a baseball. I don't know why I feel like I need to say that, but I do here. Some of us, here's the reality, some of us learned how to do things in a not so protected way, right? Like we learned how to ride a bike, not by riding on this nice, soft, grassy area or padded area, right? We learned to ride our bikes on dirt roads with gravel, right? Anybody?
Oh, yeah.
We learned how to swim, not necessarily by going to years and years of swimming lessons, but by having our dads throw us into the water, right? No. Oh, just me. Okay, great. Here we go. We learned how to defend ourselves on the playground by having to defend ourselves on the playground, right? Like we learn how to do these things in order, through sometimes an effort of struggle. Some of us learned how to do things in a not so protected way, but not all parents think this way anymore, okay? And this is not a sermon on parenting, okay? I'm just using this as an illustration, getting us into the bulk of it here. Not all parents think this way anymore. There is a relatively new kind of phenomena of overprotective parents. I don't know if you've seen this or not. I want to give you 3 terms and definitions for parents that are starting to emerge here in the last few years. First one is this: helicopter parents. You heard about that?
I know that one.
All the teachers in the room are laughing right now. Helicopter parents. Here's a helicopter parent. A parent who takes an overprotective or excessive interest in the life of their child. On the surface, that doesn't sound bad, but there's a limit, right? Like there's a line where they're 18 years old and you won't let them go to a sleepover by themselves, right? Like that might be too much. Okay. Second one, lawnmower parents. These are parents that go to extreme lengths to protect their children from facing any sort of adversity or obstacle. They may do this by either steering their kids toward a different, easier, or simpler path, or by simply handling it on their own for their children. Third one, bulldozer parents. Bulldozers are similar to lawnmower parents, only it's a lot more aggressive. They forge ahead before their child, removing all obstacles, ensuring every success along the way for their children. This is kind of the new phenomenon that's coming out in parents. And then you have parents who raise their kids to be Kansas City Chiefs fans, and that's more like child abuse. I say that knowing we have visitors from Kansas here right now. Like, it's in the notes, so I have to say it. All the love in the world. Two things I know to be true that we want to flesh out a little bit this morning. And that's this. First one is this. Suffering is not the enemy. So many times we like to frame our lives around avoiding suffering. Suffering is not the enemy. Second one is similar to it. Sheltering is not always our friend either. So many times we want to live in this world where we're avoiding suffering and we're sheltering ourselves as much as possible. Neither one of those things are always the best for us. And let me be clear, as your minister here, I am not a helicopter, lawnmower, or bulldozer minister, okay? And as the leadership team here, I can speak for them. We are not this as a church. Do we care about you?
Yes.
Absolutely. We love you, and we would do anything that we can for you. But this is how I believe that we care for you as a church, biblically, and it comes from James chapter 1. It says this, "Consider it a great joy, my brothers, whenever you experience various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces endurance, but endurance must do its complete work, so that you may be mature and complete, lacking nothing. For now, if any of you lacks wisdom, he should ask God, who gives to all generously and without criticizing, and it will be given to him." This is, in my opinion, our philosophy of how we love you as a church. Suffering confirms a few truths for us. Today we're talking about suffering, okay? It's kind of a downer. We're going to do our best to make it light, but here's the reality. Suffering confirms a few truths for us. The first one is this. Suffering confirms that we are alive, right?
Yes.
It confirms for us that we're alive. Hey, if you have kicked it, you ain't suffering anymore, right?
That's right.
I mean, that's just the reality. And we say that when we're talking about people maybe who have struggled with things like disease or whatever the case for a long period of their lives and then they pass away. What do we say so many times? We say, well, they're not suffering anymore. Praise God, they're no longer in pain anymore, right? Suffering confirms that we are alive. Second one, suffering confirms that we can feel, right? If you're suffering, you can feel. I want to share with you some notes from a book called Leadership Pain, God's Classroom for Growth. It was written by a man named Sam Cheyenne, if I can get his name right. He says this, he says, "Pain isn't the enemy. The inability or unwillingness to face pain is a far greater danger." The inability or unwillingness to face pain is a far greater danger in our lives than the pain in and of itself. In his book, he tells about a doctor by the name of Dr. Brand who was treating a 4-year-old through several years. Her name was Tanya. And he was treating her down at the leprosy hospital in Louisiana. And he had been with this patient for quite some time. He had examined her. But he writes about a specific time that she came in because she had a dislocated ankle. And he noticed she felt no pain. Like through this, she was feeling no pain. He diagnosed her with congenital indifference to pain, which is a condition similar to leprosy. Years later, he learned that Tanya had lost both legs due to amputation, as well as most of her fingers, and her elbows were constantly dislocated. She chewed her tongue so badly that it was always swollen and dislocated.
Oh my gosh.
And her own father abandoned the family because of the shame that he felt, because he saw her not as his child, but as a monster. Dr. Brand wrote this. She said, Tanya is no monster, only an extreme example, a human metaphor, really, of life without pain. She's a metaphor of life without pain. One night, late after flying to London for a conference, Dr. Brand arrived at his hotel room, and after settling in for the night, he's taking off his shoes and getting ready for bed, and he begins to realize on one of his feet, he doesn't have any feeling in his foot. And as a doctor, he's trying to figure out what's going on. He takes a pin and he stabs himself in the skin right underneath the ankle and feels nothing. As a doctor going through his mind now, he's thinking through what could this be. Well, he works in a leprosy hospital. He's thinking, I've caught leprosy. And so he spends all night tossing and turning, trying to think through what he needs to do. How is this going to affect his family and everything? The next morning, he gets out of bed and immediately he grabs the pin again, shoves it into his foot, and he yells because the pain is there. And he says, never in my life have I been more excited to have pain in my life, right? And from then on, whenever he felt discomfort from a cut or injury, he responded in gratitude to God, thanking God for the pain. Sometimes pain is a good thing. Sam Cheyenne, continued in that book, and he says this. He said, paradoxically, Christians often have more difficulty handling personal pain than unbelievers. They look at the promises of God and conclude that God should fill their lives with joy, love, support, and success. That's reading the Bible selectively. The scriptures state clearly and often that enduring pain is one of the ways, perhaps the main way, God works his grace deeply into our lives. Pain is the way God works in our lives. So many times we strive for happiness in our lives, right? We strive for comfort. We strive for ease. We want things to go well. But the reality is, what we learn from Scripture is we are formed through struggle. We are formed and built up through pains. We are formed and built up through things like criticism, right? And so instead of trying to get revenge on somebody who criticizes you, or instead of trying to immediately get out of a difficult situation, what do we need to be doing? We need to be asking God, what are you trying to teach me through this, right? God, what are you trying to show me through this time in my life? Our response to pain in life shouldn't be to try and avoid it, but to try and figure out what does God want us to gain through this process. It's a path to holiness that God allows us to go on. Finally, the last truth we want to admit here this morning really quick is this: suffering confirms that we are most likely trying something significant. Suffering tends to define that maybe we are trying something significant. If we're just sitting on the sidelines, we're trying to have an easy life, we're probably not going to achieve anything significant in our life through that process. But if we're trying to reach something, if we're trying to attain a goal, if we're trying to have purpose in this life, so many times we're going to have to struggle through that in order to achieve that. This is what 1 Peter says about suffering. 1 Peter chapter 2, starting in verse 19 through 23, says this: For it brings favor if, mindful of God's will, someone endures grief from suffering unjustly. For what credit is there if you sin and are punished, and you endure it? But when you do what is good and suffer, if you endure it, this brings favor with God. For you were called to this, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example so that you should follow him in his steps. He did not commit sin; no deceit was found in his mouth. When he was reviled, he did not revile in return. When he was suffering, he did not threaten, but entrusted himself to the one who judges justly. We want to look at this morning and draw out some things that maybe we can learn from 1 Peter as well as other places about suffering this morning. The first thing we want to learn is this: suffering is a chance to experience favor. Suffering is a chance to experience favor from God. Some translations say it differently. Some translations say that it brings grace. My translation says that it brings favor. But this is what Peter writes. He says, for it brings favor or grace when someone endures grief from suffering. And I think that suffering can bring us to a place to where there is no other options in our life, right? Like so many times we get to that place where we have no other options, everything is kind of bad, and we have nowhere else to go other than to reach out to God and search for His grace, right? Like we can find ourselves in the midst of pain and suffering. We find ourselves with nothing else left. We can find ourselves with no other options, and God can shower us with His favor and grace in very real and tangible ways, right? And the reality is this: when grace of God is your only hope, you learn to only hope in the grace of God. Right? When the grace of God is the only thing left, we learn that that is really the only thing that we need in our life. And here's the confusion. You hear people say, like, well, grace, all that has to do with salvation, right? Like Amazing Grace, we sing that song in our head, right? What does that have to do with pain and suffering? Well, I think it has everything to do with pain and suffering, because grace is getting something good when you deserve something bad, right? It's getting something good when you deserve something bad. Sometimes we suffer because we don't, or because we do deserve it, right? Like sometimes we suffer because we do deserve it. Like let's see if you're paying attention. Sometimes you suffer because you're riding four-wheelers out at midnight at your friend's pasture and you hit a cow trail, right? Anybody? From a couple weeks ago? Okay. Yeah. Sometimes we make bad choices though, right? Sometimes we sin intentionally. Sometimes we hurt people. Sometimes we act ungodly. Sometimes we suffer because of the decisions we make. This is exactly why we need grace, right? This is exactly why we need grace in our life. This is when we get to the place of crying out to God for a new and fresh start and experience His grace. Where we say, I did something bad. God, I desire something good. God, I need to be delivered from my pain and suffering. We're at that place where our only hope is the grace of God. The next time we're suffering, we need to thank God for His grace and for His love and for His favor. The second thing we want to learn this morning is this: suffering is a chance to be more mindful of God.
Okay.
Suffering gives us a chance to be more mindful of God. This is what Peter says. He says, for it brings favor if, mindful of God's will, someone endures grief from suffering unjustly. Honestly, how often do we think about God? How often do you really think about God during your week? I mean, it's easy to think about God here and now, right? But I think so oftentimes we get in this mode of putting God in a box and on a shelf when we don't want Him or need Him, right? Like we pull the God box off the shelf and we open it up on Sunday morning. We allow Him to kind of do His thing here. And then Sunday afternoon comes and we want to have some fun, or we want to watch football without feeling judged, right? So we put God's box back up on the shelf. And we go through our week, and maybe we're in a care group or a small group or a Bible study or whatever, and so we pull the God box off during that time, right? Because that's what that time's for. But the weekend comes, and you don't want God messing up your weekend, right? And so you put God back in a box up on a shelf. And you do this over and over, and we get into this routine where God only exists in certain parts of our lives that we control. But inevitably what happens in everybody's life is at some point that cycle is interrupted with something negative that happens, right? Somebody dies. Somebody gets diagnosed with a sickness that might be terminal or life-altering. Finances hit the tank. Whatever it is, something negative happens. And what do we do in those moments more times than not? I think more times than not, instead of just grabbing the box off the shelf, we look up to God and we go, where have you been during this whole time? Right? The crap's hitting the fan. We put God on a shelf, get Him out 1 or 2 times a week, and we then accuse Him of not being there when we need Him. It's like this. I don't really think about firefighters too often until I see a fire, right? We don't want that to be our relationship with God. Suffering gives us the opportunity to be mindful of God's presence in our lives. It gives us the opportunity to think on God more in our lives, because suffering is often the time when we have a mess that we cannot fix and we're looking to Him for something supernatural. The next time you find yourself suffering, think about God and look to Him for your help. And the next time that you find yourself in a calm and a peaceful time, thank God for that.
Amen.
Be mindful about God. Number 3. Suffering is a chance to please God. Suffering is a chance to please God. Let's look at verse 20 together here. For what credit is there if you sin and are punished and you endure it? But when you do what is good and suffer, if you endure it, this brings favor with God. This brings favor with God. The struggles between fathers and children of this world is a reality, right? Like you can hear it over and over again. The effects of fatherlessness on our culture and society is growing rather than shrinking in a very negative way. Children are desiring or craving the attention and the approval and the love of their dads. And yet so many dads operate out of this mentality of, yeah, I'm going to approve of you, I'm going to love you only when you do good, rather than all of the time. This is not how God works.
Right.
Fathers, we need to be a blessing to our kids. We need to approve and love of them even when they don't deserve it. Why? Because that is exactly what God does to us.
That's right.
Amen.
Right. Amen.
In the midst of our sin and our struggle and our pain and our constantly turning away from Him, He still loves us.
Praise
Right.
God.
Yeah.
Praise God. Consider this example from the 2nd century. 2nd century AD, there was a young woman by the name of Perpetua who lived in North Africa. She made so much. She made so much of an impression on the theologian Augustine, who was a big-name theologian in the 2nd century, that he actually preached 4 sermons around her and her witness for Christ. This is what took place in 202 AD. The emperor of the region decided he was going to eradicate the Christian community out of North Africa. Wanted them gone. And so they went from place to place and arrested all of the Christians that were there. Perpetua was one of the first to be arrested. And her and her friends kept diaries of what took place over the coming days and weeks while they were in jail, leading up ultimately to their death. But Perpetua, as she was sitting in jail, her father would come and plead with her regularly, will you just say that you're not a Christian so that you can live, right? Just admit, no, I'm not a follower of Jesus, and they'll let you go. And she would simply respond time and time again to be called nothing other than a Christian. That was her desire. She wanted to be called a Christian, that was it. And then he took it up a notch and he said, you have this young infant boy. For his life, for his sake, will you just say that you're not a Christian? And she wouldn't do it. He said, I'm old. He said, I'm aging. For my sake, will you just say that you're not a Christian? And Perpetua would time and time again just respond that this was left in God's hand and she wants to be called a Christian. And on the day of their trial, they were all marched in before the judge. And they were asked one by one, and they each admitted that they were Christians. And it came time for Perpetua to give account for her belief. And her father, holding her young son, made one more plea to her. And again she refused, confirming that she was in fact a Christian. And the governor condemned them all to be thrown into the arena and killed. And they all entered the arena singing the psalms joyfully together. They were beaten, they were whipped, they were mauled by animals, and finally they were slain by the sword of gladiators in front of a large crowd cheering, all while remaining faithful through the pain and the suffering, saying, I am a Christian. I cannot deny Christ. I'm a Christian and I cannot deny Christ. I would say that God would be pleased with how Perpetua and her friends suffered in that moment. God is pleased when we suffer well. Number 4. Suffering is a chance to live a higher purpose.
Yeah.
Suffering is a chance for us to live a higher purpose. This is what Peter says again, chapter 2, verse 21. For you were called to this, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example so that you would follow in his steps. What is the purpose of your life? What is the purpose of your life? What have you been called to? Because I think if we don't answer that question intentionally, we live our lives in this cycle of getting up, going to work, coming home, eating dinner, watching TV, going to bed. And we do this through all of our life until days, weeks, months, years, decades go by where we have no real purpose in our life. And we don't matter really to anybody or anything. But if we're going to matter, if we're going to have a purpose, most of the time that comes with a little bit of struggle, with a little bit of pain, with a little bit of suffering. This is what author and preacher Erwin McManus said. He said, your greatness is on the other side of your pain.
Amen.
Your greatness, your purpose, your goal in life is all on the other side of pain. Rarely do we get to our goal, to our purpose, to making a difference in this life without going through some sort of struggle. In fact, I cannot think of anyone who was really called by God to something greater who didn't struggle at some level. I mean, think biblically through the disciples in the New Testament. All of them outside of John were persecuted and martyred for their faith. Peter, who wrote this book, he was crucified because of his faith in Jesus. And he was crucified upside down because he didn't want to be crucified in the same way that Jesus was. Suffering is a chance to be more like Jesus for us. That's what Peter talks about. Jesus suffered. And we get to look to his example. Jesus didn't quit, and we can't quit as well during hard times. We need to be faithful. We need to be strong even in the midst of suffering. Faithfulness allows us to live and have a higher purpose in order for us to encourage people, in order for us to inspire people, to show people Jesus even in the midst of suffering. The witness that we can have to other people through suffering is huge and impactful. Number 5, finally. Suffering is a chance to learn to trust God more.
Yeah.
Suffering is a chance for us to learn to trust God more. Verse 22 and 23, he did not commit sin. Talking about Jesus, no deceit was found in his mouth. And when he was reviled, he did not revile in return. And when he suffered, he did not threaten, but entrusted himself to the one who judges justly. Suffering is a chance to learn to trust God more. There's a story about a man who built a sandbox for his 3-year-old son. And he built the sandbox, and he sets it up with his son, and he puts a lot of sand in there, and he puts this big rock right in the middle of the sandbox. And he and his son go out there for weeks and have just day after day of fun playing in this sandbox. They're playing with trucks and tractors, and they're making roads and doing all this in the sandbox. And one day, Dad comes home from work, and he comes to the backyard, and his son is sitting on the edge of the sandbox crying. And Dad goes to the son. He says, well, why are you crying, son? I built this sandbox for you to enjoy, not for you to be hurt. What's going on? And the son looks up to the dad, and he says, well, it has the big rock in the middle of it, and it's in my way, and I wanted it out of the sandbox, but I can't move it. And the dad looks at the son, and he says, well, you have all the tools available to you in order to move it. And the son gets back up again. He has all the energy, and he tries to move the rocket again, and he puts all of his effort into it, trying to move the rock, but he just can't budge it. And he just falls to the ground, and he starts crying because he's without hope. And the dad walks over to the son and picks up the son, and then picks up the rock and moves it out of the sandbox. And he said, son, you didn't use all the tools available to you.
Right.
There's a power greater than you
Right.
that you didn't use. So many times we try to get through struggle on our own. So many times we try to get through difficult times on our own strength, and we get to where we have nothing yet left and we feel hopeless. That's when we need to turn to God. We need to turn to God in the midst of pain and lean into Him. He is the resources that we have. He is the tool that we have. The relationship that we have in order to make it through the struggle and the suffering. Here's the truth, church. We are going to be disappointed in our lives. We're going to have pain in our lives. We're going to have suffering in our lives. In fact, say that with me. I will suffer. I am going to suffer. Say that. I am going to suffer. What do we do when we suffer? What do we do when we go through difficult times? We become more mindful of Jesus. We become more mindful of Jesus. We look for a purpose, and we put our trust and our hope in Jesus. This is what we do. This is what gets us through. And we can realize, just as Dr. Brand did, that suffering is an opportunity to thank God for pain.
Amen.
Heavenly Father, God, I am thankful for the opportunity that we get to be here. I'm thankful that we get to come and we get to worship. We get to sing to you. We get to open your word, God. And I'm thankful that we get to, just for a moment, look at suffering and difficulty and what you want to say to us. God, let us not try to get through this life only on our own power. Let us recognize and remember that we have you. who is far greater and far more powerful than we can ever imagine at our disposal. God, we thank you for Jesus. We thank you for his love. We thank you for the example that he set for us. We thank you for what he did for us on the cross. God, I pray that we would look to him as the example for our lives, God. I pray all this in his name. Amen.